Welcome back to Complete Aviation Solutions Deep Dive. This is Deep Dive number 50.
Oh, wow. A big one.
It is a big one, and we're diving into, I guess some really fascinating developments surrounding Virgin Australia. You've brought some really compelling material to the table today.
Yeah.
And it seems like all signs are pointing to, a potential return to the Australian Stock Exchange for Virgin Australia.
Right.
So let's unpack this a little bit, see what we can learn here.
Okay.
Um, so where should we begin with this? I know that the new CEO, Dave Emerson, he just took over this month, right?
Yeah, this month.
He's already hitting the ground running.
He is. He's been actively meeting with investors. Um, and the goal seems to be an IPO.
An initial public offering,
Yeah,
potentially as early as the middle of 2025.
that's right.
That's a pretty bullish timeline.
It is. If all goes according to plan, they're talking about a capital raising phase happening in May,
Okay.
and then potentially the actual listing on the stock market happening as early as June.
Wow. It really wasn't that long ago that Virgin Australia was in, a very different position.
Right. Very different.
Just to rewind for our listeners a little bit, we're talking about an airline that was delisted back in 2020
Right.
after, entering voluntary administration. For our listeners, voluntary administration is essentially when an independent administrator comes in
Right.
and they're tasked with, rescuing the company if possible,
Yeah.
or finding a better outcome for its creditors than just immediate liquidation.
Right.
So to see this kind of potential turnaround, a potential return to the stock market just a few years later,
Yeah.
I think that's why we're so interested in this. So how did we get here? Like, what were the key steps that that led us to this potential IPO?
Okay, so after the delisting in 2020, Virgin Australia was acquired by Bain Capital.
Right.
And Bain Capital, they undertook a huge restructuring and recapitalization of the airline.
Mm-hmm.
And, from what we can gather, this restructuring, this overhaul, it seems like it's been quite successful.
Yeah.
The airline is, at least according to the material that you provided, is reportedly operating profitably.
Yeah, that's a huge turnaround.
It is. It really is.
And it doesn't seem like it was just about, cutting costs. It
Right.
sounds like there was, a really strategic rethink about, their routes, their offerings, really, I guess, refocusing their business, right?
Absolutely.
And the numbers you provided are pretty astounding. It looks like Virgin Australia achieved its best result ever
Oh, wow.
in its 24-year history in the 6 months leading up to the end of December 2025.
Right.
We're looking at a recorded underlying profit before interest and tax, so EBIT,
Yeah.
of 439 million Australian dollars,
Right.
which is about 275 million US dollars.
Right.
I mean, those numbers they have to be a big draw for potential investors.
Oh,
Right?
absolutely. That's what they're looking at. They're looking at profitability. How healthy is this business, And those numbers, they really do signal a strong and healthy business.
Right.
A business that's not just surviving, but genuinely thriving.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really remarkable.
It is.
And it wasn't just about, internal changes, it sounds like, right?
Right.
There was also some pretty strategic moves, And I'm thinking specifically about this information about Qatar Airways, right?
Oh, yeah.
So what do we know there?
So one of the really significant developments is the approval by the Australian authorities for Qatar Airways to purchase a 25% stake in Virgin Australia
Okay.
for a reported 750 million Australian dollars,
Which
comes out to about 470 million US dollars.
Wow.
That's a substantial investment.
It really is. It's
Yeah.
a huge vote of confidence.
Right.
So how does an investment of that magnitude, how does that actually play into these potential IPO plans?
Well, this investment, it really provides a huge boost, not only to Virgin Australia's financial standing,
Right.
but also to investor confidence.
Okay.
Having a major international airline like Qatar Airways
Yeah.
as a substantial shareholder,
Yeah.
that really adds a whole layer of credibility
Right.
and stability to the company.
Yeah.
I mean, it might even be, the missing piece that wasn't there
Yeah.
when they considered an IPO previously.
Okay, so now that Qatar Airways is on board,
Yeah.
what does the ownership of Virgin Australia look like now?
Okay, so after the Qatar Airways deal, Bain Capital, they're going to retain the majority stake in Virgin Australia at 68%.
Okay.
Other current shareholders include Virgin Group at 5% and the Queensland Investment Corporation holding 2%.
Okay, so Bain Capital is still the I guess the majority shareholder.
The majority shareholder, yes.
But it's interesting, they're planning to maintain a significant shareholding even after the IPO.
They are.
What do you think that says?
Well, it suggests to me that they're not just looking for a quick exit. They see the potential for long-term growth and value in the airline.
Yeah, it makes sense.
It does.
And as I understand it, this isn't the first time that Bain has sort of considered returning Virgin Australia to the public market.
Right.
Right, they've kind of tested the waters before.
They have. Bain Capital previously considered an IPO back in 2023.
Okay.
And they actually conducted investor roadshows to kind of gauge the level of interest.
Yeah.
And while those plans were eventually put on hold, all that groundwork that they laid,
Yeah.
that's really expected to accelerate this current IPO process.
Right, because they've already done a lot of, I guess, the initial legwork
Right, exactly.
of talking to investors, understanding the market appetite.
Exactly.
They're not starting from scratch.
No, they're not. And it seems like the current push to engage investors is really quite active.
Yeah, so what does that look like?
Well, following those initial meetings that took place in Sydney on April 1st, Emerson.
The CEO.
Yes.
Yeah.
He's scheduled to continue meeting with potential investors in Melbourne.
Yeah.
And then he's heading to Singapore to reach out to Asia-based investors.
So that's interesting. They're really broadening the scope
They are.
of their outreach. They're not just focused domestic.
They're not. This is a global play.
Yeah, very interesting.
It is.
So, okay, if we kind of zoom out now and look at the bigger picture,
Yeah.
what are the big takeaways for us? What are the key things about this potential IPO that, that we should be paying attention to?
Well, I think this potential mid-2025 IPO,
Yeah.
it really marks a significant moment in Virgin Australia's journey
Yeah.
since its delisting in 2020. The fact that this is even a possibility
Yeah.
just 5 years later.
Yeah.
I mean, that really speaks volumes about, the extent of this transformation.
It does. It really is a remarkable turnaround.
It is. And several factors have converged to make this possible.
Yeah.
First and foremost, the return to profitability.
Right.
Those financial results are really impressive. The substantial investment by Qatar Airways,
Yeah.
that was a game changer.
Yeah.
And then the fact that they've already laid the groundwork for an IPO through their previous attempts.
Right.
Those are all really critical elements supporting this move.
Yeah, and those financial results, I mean, that strong financial performance.
Yeah.
It has to be the cornerstone of all this, right?
Absolutely. I mean, those numbers, they paint a very compelling picture of recovery
Yeah,
and future potential. That's what investors want to see.
absolutely. So as we wrap up here, what does this all mean,
Yeah.
for the Australian aviation landscape?
Right.
And, for people like us who are, interested in these kinds of industry shifts.
Well, this IPO, if it does go ahead, it has the potential to inject a huge amount of capital into Virgin Australia,
Right.
which could fuel even more growth
Yeah.
and potentially even more competition in the market.
Right.
It will be very interesting to see how investors react to this news in the coming months,
Yeah.
because that will tell us a lot about how confident the market is in Virgin Australia's future.
Absolutely. I think that's a great point. This deep dive has really been fascinating. It's given us a glimpse into the complex world of airline finance, the strategic decision-making that goes on behind the scenes.
It is a high-stakes game.
It really is, yeah. And it raises an important question for me and hopefully for our listeners as well.
Yeah.
Beyond the financial numbers, beyond, the profits and losses,
Right.
what else, what other factors do you think are really crucial for an airline to thrive in today's world?
Right.
In this dynamic, ever-changing aviation industry?
That's a great question. And I think, it's something for our listeners to ponder as they follow this story.
Yeah,
What are those intangible qualities that make an airline truly successful?
absolutely.
It's a conversation we'll have to continue another time.
I think so, too. Well, thank you so much. This has been great.
My pleasure.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us for another Complete Aviation Solutions Deep Dive.